Okay, so I'm actually going to be sharing a little bit of my personal journey today. And so I would really like it if we could sort of maybe gather a little bit closer. I don't know if that's all right for people at the back, but it would be nice for me to feel that we're all together.
Coming the long way around to the front.
Because this can be quite a lonely spot at the front of the church. And it's really nice to feel that we're a family together this morning. There may be some emotion from me, so I hope that's okay. But I want to assure you, I think I'm ringing a little bit. I want to assure you that this is a good news story. So it might sound a bit tough or bleak at the beginning, but there's a happy ending. Okay, I want you to hold on to that. It's in two parts. We're going to have readings and a song in between. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's some pictures of me when I was very little. Well, I would say that I was an odd child growing up. I mean, nobody really told me that directly, but I felt it about myself. I just felt different to other children, and I felt on the outside of things, and I never really felt as if I really belonged anywhere. I don't really know what happened in my family. I don't really know why my mum was so unhappy. I only know that by the time I came along, my dad had decided that the next time my mum threatened to leave, he was going to say, okay, go. My dad had given up the struggle of trying to make my mum happy. But then, as he used to say to me, you came along. And of course, I was to be the answer to all of my mum's problems. I was to be the answer, a new baby was to be the answer to all of my mum's unhappiness. And of course, it doesn't really work like that. Babies don't come to fix things. And so things went downhill quite quickly. And by the time I was 3 years old, my mum had left our home. She spent time in a convalescent home where she met her future husband. And by the time I was 10 years old, 10 or 11, my mum was living in Australia with her third husband. Now, the message that I got from all of this was actually that I should never have been born. I truly believed that I should not have come along. Because I believed that if I hadn't have come, then maybe my parents might have sorted out their problems. You know, my brother would have grown up a bit and things would have got easier. So I truly believed that about myself. So my dad was awarded custody of my brother and I, and he brought us up on his own. He did the best that he could, but it was hard. He was working full-time, obviously. And as a sensitive child, I really noticed the burden that he carried and having to sort out childcare, having to sort out where we would go in the holidays, off to relatives and all sorts of different people. And I was very aware as well of how having my brother and I on his own interfered with his social life, interfered with his career, and of course it made it almost impossible for him to meet somebody else. So I really kind of was aware of that. I felt that I was a burden, and I think I would probably say I felt like I was a nuisance, generally speaking. Well, very much so, very much so. Let's just say it as it is. So, when I was about 13, my dad remarried, which is often a good thing, but for me it wasn't a good thing at all. We probably made a bit of an effort for a few months, possibly up to a year. But it became very clear to my brother and I that she very much disapproved of us. She didn't like us. And she had very subtle and different ways of showing us her disapproval. And as a sensitive girl as I was, I found it absolutely intolerable. And I would spend as much time as possible at my friend's house. If she was in one room, I would be in another. In fact, if she was at home, I would be somewhere else. And that was my life, really, until I left home. And the one thing, and this may make me cry, but please bear with me, one thing I couldn't stand was the way that she would look at me. Just as if, I don't know, as if I was a piece of dirt. And I know now that how deeply that affected me. And I think I developed some very difficult beliefs about myself at the time. So I think it would be true to say I felt pretty worthless. And I think it would be true to say I actually felt bad. Because when someone treats you like that, day in, day out, you think it must be your fault. There has to be something wrong with you. And so that's sort of what happened to me. And I understand now, through my training and all of that stuff, that actually what developed within me was a very deep-rooted sense of shame. Now, shame is very different from guilt. Feeling guilty or ashamed of something that you've done wrong is enormously helpful because you can usually do something about it or you can change, and it prompts us to become different, and it's good. Shame is something that takes root deep within us and makes us feel that we are somehow bad. There's something wrong with us, and there's not a lot you can do about that, quite frankly. So that was kind of me growing up. And I know that this has probably been it sounds quite grim. I know it's been quite hard for some people to listen to. But before we have our first readings and then a song, I want you to know that this is not the whole story of Kate growing up, and it's never the whole story about anybody. Because there were other things about me that couldn't be touched by this, because there were things that I was good at, naturally good at, like running and sport. And I was naturally a joiner-inner. I wasn't a sort of on the sidelines person, so I would join in with things. And I was in all of the school shows and plays and all that sort of thing, which I absolutely loved. I had a natural love of learning, which I still have because I'm an eternal student. I can't seem to stop. And I also had and have a natural curiosity. And one of the things that I was curious about as a child was God. I was really curious about him. And I thought, well, I didn't know whether he was there because, dads are supposed to know about these things, but my dad didn't seem to know. So, how do you find out? But I figured as a child, either God is not there at all, and you've got all these people in churches praying to him, and quite frankly, they're completely wasting their time because he doesn't exist, he's not real. Or God is real, he is there, and they're not wasting their time at all because he's hearing their prayers. And I figured that if there is a God in heaven, then he would want to make it possible for people to know that he's real. It didn't make any sense to me that there could be a God in heaven and all these people on earth wondering, I wonder if there's a God. It didn't make any sense. I thought, what if there's a God? He'd want them to know that he's there. So I decided as a child that there must be steps that you can take to find out if there's a God. And one day, I'm going to find out. I'm going to do it for myself. So I'm going to leave you there. We're going to have 2 very short readings, and then we're going to have a song. and then we're going to come back.
This comes from Jeremiah chapter 29. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future.
Zephaniah says, on that day it will say to Jerusalem, do not fear Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing.
Well, part 2. So my opportunity to find out whether or not God was there and whether or not he was real came when I was asked to be godmother to my nephew. I was now about 30 years old. I had been married and divorced, and I was living in St. Albans. And I remember turning up at this church and being very warmly welcomed. But before very long, somebody handed me a card, and I found myself having to read out the words that were on this card. And I think they went something like this. It says, I renounce evil. I repent of my sins. No, I'll be fine. I turn to Christ. And I remember thinking, hang on a minute here, hold your horses. What on earth am I saying? I seem to be making promises to a God that I don't even know exists. And this is all a bit, woo. So I felt that was actually a moment when I just decided to find out more, basically. And I started going to this church. And it was a very welcoming church. It was very warm. I'm a joiner-inner. I ended up joining the choir. I was sort of becoming a bit involved. But I was frustrated because I couldn't find anybody who could talk to me about their faith. I couldn't find anybody who could tell me what it was all about. So it was very social, this church, but I was like, so I felt like I could have this there was this aroma of really good coffee coming from the distance. And I could smell it, but I couldn't get hold of a cup of coffee and taste it. But fortunately, what happened next was, I have no idea what the screen's going to do. Oh, okay. I decided to make a trip out to Australia to see my mum, who was now quite poorly. And I couldn't stay with her. I didn't know what to do, and I needed help. And I don't have time this morning to tell you about all the wonderful things that started happening in my life at this time, all the amazing coincidences that happened. I'd love to have a chance to do that one day, but not this morning. But I will tell you that there was a letter that I wrote, being naive, to the Bishop of Melbourne, asking him for help. Yes, seriously, it was my vicar's suggestion. And that this letter, so I was sort of saying, I'm coming out to see my mum, I can't stay with her, is there a church nearby, would somebody be able to put me up, that sort of thing. And this letter found its way to a local congregation, local to my mum. And it was read out by the vicar to the congregation on a Sunday morning. And there was a lady there that morning called Betty, and she felt, as this letter was read out, she felt a hand being put on her shoulder physically, and she heard God say, I want you to look after this young woman when she comes out to see her mum. And she did. So I stayed with Betty for a month, and she was just wonderful. She was like a mum to me. She's still alive, and she prayed for me every day. And I think what happened for me was that being around Betty made such a difference to me, because she was the first Christian I had met who I would call a heart and soul Christian. She had such a love for God. So she would pray, and she prayed with me, and she would talk about the Bible and read the Bible and that sort of thing. And I concluded that if God was real for her in the way that he clearly was, he must be real. I didn't think she was making it up. And then that made me wonder, well, if God's real for Betty, maybe he can be real for me. And fortunately for me, Betty introduced me to a clergy couple who had a ministry of prayer ministry. And I went to their home. I shared with them a little bit of my story. My mum, it was very difficult. It was very painful. And they offered to pray for me. And as they prayed, I felt this power going through my body. And I'd like to say it was a good experience, but actually I thought I was going to die because it was like a pressure building up inside me. And somehow I knew that I had to tell this elderly clergy couple about some of the things that I'd done in the past that I felt really, really bad about. Things that I had done when I was lost and looking for love, that sort of thing. And I was like, oh my goodness. So anyway, I did. I said, I've got to share something with you. I don't know why, I just feel like I have to, otherwise I'm going to die. And they were very good, fortunately. They, I imagine they must have led me in prayers of saying sorry to God. I imagine there must have been prayers of receiving God's forgiveness, that kind of thing. But what I do remember is that after all of that, the chap went to his bookcase and took out a Bible, and he started reading and saying, I believe God is saying these words to you, Kate. And it was the reading that we had earlier from Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. I know. And I remember that night sort of sitting up in bed and sort of trying to find this passage in Jeremiah, and then realizing Jeremiah is a really big book and I didn't know where it was, but just thinking, wow, God knows me. God knows me. And all this time I felt like I should never have been born. And here's God saying, no, I know you. So I knew that I was meant to be born because God meant me to be born, which is absolutely wonderful. So now I knew that God was real, and I knew that God knew me, and that sort of felt like enough. I sort of thought that was it. But when I came back to the UK, I started visiting a church nearby in Chorley Wood called St Andrews. And there I witnessed people giving testimonies about lives being utterly transformed, people being physically healed by God. And I experienced people worshipping God with all their heart and soul. I mean, just passionate worship of God, led by a very young Matt Redman, by the way. And I felt on the outside of things, I thought, well, that's not me. I'm not there yet. And I thought, oh, I wonder there's a barrier here. I can't reach God. But fortunately, I keep saying fortunately, I found my way into joining a little group that were exploring things like childhood things, freedom, wholeness, that sort of stuff. And I just knew, I had this sudden sense that God wanted me to give everything to him. Everything. So I did. I said to these girls, I just feel like God wants me to give everything to him. And one lady led me in a prayer. And I just surrendered my whole life to God. I invited Jesus to come and be Lord of my life completely. And it was at that moment that God said these words to me. It was the longer passage that Grace read. But I suppose the bit that I hold on to so preciously is he will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. Can you imagine hearing the words of God saying that to me, even me? And so the next time that, sorry, we'll go back to that. The next time I was at St Andrews and there was this passionate worship, that included me. And I felt, I can come close to God in worship. There was no barrier. And I was like, wow, even me. Can you imagine somebody like me now no longer on the outside, but on the inside? No longer feeling as if I don't belong anywhere or I'm a bit odd or whatever. No, I belong to God now. I'm his. I've been adopted into his family. And so as I did that, as I began sort of drawing close to God in worship and through reading the Bible and that sort of stuff, God began dealing with these old beliefs that I held. And what I realised was that it's really, really hard to believe something like, I should never have been born. You know, when God says, I know the plans I have for you. And it's very difficult to believe and hold on to that belief that you're a nuisance when God says, I have a purpose for your life. And this one takes longer, but you cannot consistently hold on to a belief about yourself as bad when God says, I delight in you. I delight in you. And how can you hang on to a belief that you're worthless when God calls you his precious daughter or son? And that's the thing that God says to me, probably more than anything else, when God speaks, is my precious daughter. We are his precious sons and daughters, and we can all draw close to him. And what happens to shame in this situation? It has to go. Amen.
Okay, over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm actually going to be sharing a little bit of my personal journey today. And so I would really like it if we could sort of maybe gather a little bit closer. I don't know if that's all right for people at the back, but it would be nice for me to feel that we're all together.